Thank you very much. It's been for me the first time to be part of the NTS consortium. I basically have about 35 years of working in the area of international migration and development. And after a short teaching assignment in 3 different countries, in Zambia, Ethiopia, and the US, which was part of my doctoral studies, I joined the UN in '90 with ILO, and then moved to the Economic Commission for Africa, and then to IOM. So I've had the opportunity to work at the national level with governments, then at the regional level, looking at Africa, and then moving to my headquarters in Geneva and covering 47 countries at that time. Sub-Saharan Africa, and then South Asia. And then I was in Turkey, right in the midst of humanitarian crisis. First time with an earthquake, and then with the conflict. And then my last posting before I retired was India, also with IOM as a special envoy to India. And so it's been quite an interesting journey for me. Just recently, more than 160 states basically signed what they call a global compact on migration. And this was after several years of being polarized, not having a consensus or a coherence in the field. So on one side, we were calling this a singular, significant achievement in multilateralism. And on the other side, we were seeing that the environment was getting more and more closing up, more security issues were coming in, borders, xenophobia, anti-migrant sentiments, terrorism, cross-border terrorism. So this was, in my view, the perfect timing to address this issue in a conference looking at multilateralism in NTS. And I think for me what's fascinating is that since I started working in the multilateral system in one particular region, looking at it from the lens of the national governments, then looking at it from regional organizations, and negotiating agreements and being personally sitting in these meetings, drafting reports, etc. I do believe that it was a very complex, slow, the process. There was fragmentation. States were not always in agreement. When I presented my first time the issue of trafficking in Africa, trafficking of women and children, for example, which has security implications too, many governments took the floor and told us to strike the name of the government from the document. We've had governments walking out of meetings when difficult issues of refugees were being discussed. But now we do not find that anymore. Governments want to talk about these issues, are wanting to build their capacities, looking for technical support on what kind of legislation is needed, what kind of framework do we build at the country level or at the regional level. So we do see that relative to the past, it has been a slow path, but there has been a lot of improvement, and we are on the right path. And I do look forward to seeing how governments will work on these issues now. I would say there was what we call the North-South divide. There was, we've been using a lot of categories. Undocumented migrants, irregularity in movements. So a lot of categories and a lot of divisions had come in. And I think what we are really seeing now, that countries themselves are realizing that they can no longer be just a country of destination, because they are dealing with migrants, with their own nationals going out of the country, whilst they're receiving a lot of foreigners into their country, and very often they're used as transit points. So today, those dichotomies have completely broken down in terms of who's a country of origin, who's traditionally a receiving country, and we find that these problems really are across the globe, and you cannot really make these distinctions anymore. And this is very important for countries themselves to understand. It is on the uptrend, and I do believe that we've reached a point where it would be very, very hard to backtrack completely. We've had small achievements in earlier periods, and yet there has been a crisis which has tended to make people look backwards. But I think we have crossed that hurdle. What is really needed now is a high sense of commitment, and this has to be across the board. Governments who are signatories to agreements need actually now to make sure that they enforce them, that they provide the necessary resources, and they also provide the necessary human resources, in fact, not only just budgets, but also the capacity and the human resources to implement some of these agreements. Where we need some more work is more looking at how do we hold governments accountable. How do we actually monitor achievements of countries? Migration as a phenomena, as you know, and dealing with mobility requires new tools, new methodologies, and there's a whole push now for bringing in more data. So some of these issues, which I believe we are not going to backtrack on, I think these need to continue and we need to move forward.
So my name is Pacharadin. I'm currently the Senior Fellow at the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace, CICP, based in Phnom Penh, which I'm also looking after. I'm coordinator of the Global Center for Mekong Study, GCMS, Cambodia Center. GCMS is a Track 2 think tank network established by the LMC, meaning Mekong Lam Chang government, and has been endorsed by the Phnom Penh Declaration during the second Foreign Ministers Summit in Siem Reap. So basically we're looking after and providing recommendation to the Mekong Lam Chang government on the Mekong Lam Chang cooperation issues. Address that first of all, Southeast Asia and Mekong sub-region in particular is one of the fastest growing economy in the world, and with this robust growth there comes with economic disparity gaps and of course certainly inequality. However, when speaking of economic inequality rationale, which is rational or multilateral corporations, there are certain aspects such as infrastructure connectivities, cross-border economic cooperations, poverty alleviation, of course, and water resources, because it's a Mekong. But while economic inequality is one of the non-traditional security, we should also looking at some other non-traditional security that kind of involve and contribute to the economic inequality at large, which is certainly things like climate change, environmental hazard, unsustainable development, natural resource management, and so on. So these are all the aspects that Mekong region actually facing. And that's how the multilateral cooperation came about, to addressing all these issues. We do have a lot of multilateral cooperation in the past, but I would say, based on my observation, is mostly, if not like merely focused on trade cooperation, meaning that the amount of trade flow. So, and focus less on the aspect of inequality or inclusiveness at large. But nowadays, there are cooperation which kind of even address a wider range of issues, including people-to-people exchanges and socio-cultural connectivity or cooperation. And that kind of really play a huge role in kind of trying to loosen or minimize the disparity gaps between countries and economies. I would say a few other the initiatives are already in place, but I think some other option to be considered is there ought to be a coordination mechanism or a synergizing effort between all the existing Mekong mechanism, and there are already 8 to be precise, different Mekong mechanism, and Mekong Lam Chang Corporation is the latest to join the group, and in future there could be more. So to looking at coordination mechanism to strengthen the regional cooperation at large is very important, so as to attain the economic growth of each particular country, but also to minimize the economic disparity gaps and inequality, as well as to advance the cooperation at large. And secondly, I think there ought to be more constructive and substantive engagement with all relevant stakeholders at the regional, subnationals, as well as national level, that working on the non-traditional issues, because economic inequality is not just inequality on its own, but its linkage, as I mentioned earlier, from the different issues that arise from the non-traditional security. So there ought to be a wider range of engagement, and not just within the region, but we can also extend it to other, but maybe divided in 2 different stages, as I did mention. First of all, regional, and then national, and then subnational on different issues. So I think with that constructive, the road toward more to minimize the inclusivity, to minimize the disparities, and to strengthen more inclusivity, it will be much greater.
My name is Han Feng from Chinese Academy of Social Science. I'm specialized in the regional studies, especially the Southeast Asia, for the regional political and economic studies. At the Chinese Academy of Social Science, we have many institutions covering the whole range of social science and humanities. My institute is Asia Pacific. In Asia, the developing level has been quite diverse because of the history, economic development levels, and other reasons. So it's very important for international approach. But now we have achieved some progress, but also a lot of dissatisfied in the different countries, or even at regional level. So we should have more multilateral approach in the new area. We do have the cooperation, and also in that field, I mentioned we have some progress. What I mean here is, apart from the economic development, we try very hard to let the less developed countries being more marginalized. So we did have some progress. It's a good question. So we have economic division of labor across the region. This is a natural economic division of labor, which is useful, but not enough. So we should have more efforts to be given in the cooperation for the regional participation in a more wider level, and just beyond the natural division of labor. Inequality issues has been in this area, or even within the member state for a long time. So a lot of experience has been reached in a common sense in dealing with these kind of issues, which may be efficient in a certain area, certain country, and certain industries. But we should put them together and to have the joint efforts from the government, enterprises, and the regional local governments. So in this way, we can go beyond the existing efforts by one government or by a local government, by a single area's efforts. Parallel efforts already, that is government's efforts and also economic means. So we should put them together and to have more exchange and joint efforts for the issue together.
I'm Major General Munir Zaman. I'm president of the Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies, which is an independent strategic and security think tank based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I'm also the chairman of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change, which is an international expert body that works on security implications of climate change. As you know, that Asia is one of the primary regions that is greatly adversely impacted by the conditions of climate change, and it needs a collective and a multilateral approach in the response mechanism. As you all know, that climate change is an issue and a concern that cannot be addressed by a single country or a single group of nations. It is far wider, the implications are wider, and therefore it needs regional and wider approaches and multilateral platforms to have the response mechanism in the policy domain and in the response mechanism. At the moment, the international mechanisms and the platforms on climate change are functioning, but they are faltering because the pace of climate change impacts are rapid and the platforms are not working at the same pace. The notable ones that I can mention is that we have been able to sign the Paris Peace Agreement in Paris during COP23, but I see that that is also faltering because some nations are pulling out, notably the United States, and some nations are not performing as much as they should perform. We are asking everybody in this field to come up with more practical solutions to multilateral approach so that we have a practical solution to the issues of climate change. The first critical initiative that is needed is to implement what we've all agreed and signed on in COP23 in Paris, which is the Paris Peace Agreement, which essentially talks about capping the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So we are saying that we cannot even afford to go to 2 degrees. We have to cap the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And if we want to achieve that, we have to do a lot in terms of emission control, in terms of mitigation, in terms of various green energy and green technology that we have to bring in. So there is a lot that has to be done if we really want to achieve 1.5 degrees. The private sector is extremely important in climate change responses for the reason that bulk of the technology that exists today belongs to the private sector. And many of these technologies will have to go for radical adaptation and change. And if we have to green ourselves, then the private sector has to come into play. For example, if we have to make our cars green and take the fossil fuel out of our cars, then it has to be the private sector, the auto industry that's to be brought in, and they're the only ones who can do the change. The policy can be given by the public policy domain or the state, but the implementation has to be at the private sector level.
My name is Jean Boguet. I am an associate professor at the University of Sydney, Australia, within the Business School Executive Education, and also within the School of Social and Political Science, still at the University of Sydney. My role is to think and develop special education programs that eventually will be tested so that over time they can trickle down to main education. So I specialize in experimental education. It is very important to address this issue because we live in a global world. We live in a world where social media dictates all rules of engagement. Decisions are made at very short notice, and often, sadly, information which now has become information warfare includes fake news and manipulation of information. So it is very important to have multilateral cooperation to develop mechanisms to protect society or vulnerable people, or even systems for that matter, from intervention that can be adversarial. We have states now that interfere in the affair of others, but we also have groups now, non-state actors, that are becoming more active. We have networks of terrorism that are becoming more active. So looking at issues of security together, we will be able to look at those rules that we need to protect to keep society safer. I think multilateral cooperation could be much, much better. We have new populism, new nationalism. We have a sense that states, groups, organizations, institutions want to protect what they have. So there is a notion of sharing, but sharing in a very selective way, and that is problematic. So we need to change the culture to return to what multilateral cooperation should be in areas of sharing knowledge, sharing information, and also protecting society from adverse influence. This cannot be done at single level. It must be done through groups and organization or institution that function together. And I think at this point we had this probably better in some years ago, but we have lost that because of that sense of protectionism, and we need to reverse that culture. I think we need to find new ways of thinking first. I mean, the future is in education, but so was the past. Education is always the most important. But when we look at education, we need to define new ways of thinking. We need to look in spaces we have never done before, such as issues of knowledge. What is knowledge? How do we transfer knowledge? How do we share knowledge sovereignty? Only through these processes will we be able to ascertain new mechanisms and create new mechanisms to explore issues of manipulation of knowledge, manipulation of information. And we can do it only if we work together. This cannot be done alone because we live in a global society where social media, for example, has no limit. So we need to work together to create those mechanisms. So we need to look at it from a sociological perspective, from a psychological, from a cultural, from a social, and even look at issues of security together. I think security is probably the most important at this point, because security is fought by issues of terrorism, issues of knowledge that has been stolen, by manipulation of information. So security to me is the most important. If we can address issues of security together, security of knowledge, physical security, security of the individual, of the group, of society, then we will be able to work together to look at issues of environment, look at issues of migration, social development. So when I talk about security, I don't talk only about defense, about military. I talk about political security, social security.